from 1981 to 1988. From 1990 until 2020, he was working in the investment banking sector in several positions. He has published 2 book articles, and the name is When Keynes and Minsky Meet, Mandelbrot, Uncertainty in a Non-Ergodic System in Keynes' General Theory for Today, Contemporary Perspectives, Edward Elgar, 2012. And the other one is Schumpeter and Keynes After the Financial Crisis, Progressive Post-Keynesian Opportunities in Progressive Post-Keynesian Economics, Dealing with Reality, Edward Elgar, 2019. He held a lecture at Cambridge University in 2016. The name is How Should the Post-Keynesian School Define Uncertainty? He has published an article in Turkish Economic Review in 2018. The name is The Crisis and Its Consequences for Society and Economic Theory. And a book review in the same journal in 2016. Paul Davidson, Post-Keynesian Theory and Policy, a realistic analysis of the market-oriented capitalist economy. Well, today his focus is on ecological economics. So if you want to start, I will share my screen for your presentation, Stefan.
Okay.
Yeah, it's here. If anybody can see my screen.
Yes, I can see. So
perfect. Okay.
the question is, why did ecological economics fail to persuade many economists? So could you put the next slide, please? Can you show the next? Yeah, no, the structure. Okay, yeah. The structure of this paper is first Karl Polanyi, and as second topic is the development of the environmental movement. Point 3 is 6 leading ecological economists, and I figured out Wolfgang Harich, Rudolf Barrow, Robert Habermann were communists or socialists. And on the other hand, Robert and Edward Skidelsky, Binswanger, and Schumacher. They're post-Keynesians and autoliberal economists. And I will discuss these different strands. Point 5 is the rise of neoliberalism, and which was also a friction in the environmental movement. And point 6 is we come to the conclusion why ecological minded economists could not succeed. Point 7 is I draw the conclusion or proposal what must follow up. So next slide, please. Karl Polanyi. Karl Polanyi is my predecessor of the environmental movement. When you read the Great Transformation, he describes the fundamental changes from a feudalistic society to a market society. And he describes land, labor, and money as fictitious commodities. Fictitious, in a sense, means that the introduction of these commodities could not have been real. For Polanyi, the definition of a commodity is something that has been produced for sale on a market. By this definition, land, labor, and money are fictitious commodities because they were not originally produced to be sold on the market. And modern economics starts by pretending that these fictitious commodities will behave in the same way as real commodities. And in this sense, Polanyi might have been a forerunner of ecological-minded economists because he outlined that land is not a common commodity. So next slide, please. The early development of the environmental movement, I've started at the point of okay, we have the history is much longer, but I started in 1962, Rachel Carson's book, The Silent Spring. And in these times, that was one of the most influential books of the 20th century, which the environmental movement gained momentum. And another milestone was the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency by President Richard Nixon in 1970. In 1972, the Club of Rome published the book, The Limits to Growth. There were 30 million copies sold worldwide in 30 different languages. And later in the late 70s, Jimmy Carter commissioned a follow-up paper, the Global 2000 report. That is the structure, I think, of the development in the environmental movement in the second half of the 20th century. Next slide, please. So I figured out 6 leading economists of these times. First, the communist approach by Wolfgang Harich, then the socialist approach by Barrow and Havemann, and the post-Keynesian approach by Skidelsky, and the ordoliberal approach by Binswanger. And at the sidelines, in my view, was standing E.F. Schumacher. So Wolfgang Harich was a communist of the GDR, and he saw the world would be able to solve the ecological crisis of mankind only in a communist world state. The state is the central organ that plans the economy and controls the needs of the individuals, contrary to the classical, classical doctrines of communism. The goal of communist world state will not be material abundance, but the reduction of material needs. His thesis is that in the face of the ecological catastrophe and the unjust distribution of property, averting the ecological catastrophe and the many interstate problems would only be conceivable based on a communist restriction of needs and consumption. Communism had to tangible and comprehensible and must not be placed in a misty, distant future. According to Harich, Western civilization has no chance of survival in the face of the impending ecological catastrophe. Only a communist world state with central planning in harmony with the reduction of human needs could offer a solution. And then there were 2 dissidents of the former GDR. That was Rudolf Barrow and Robert Havemann, and they were not so dogmatic like Harich. They did not believe that that we would need Leviathan, and they believed more in democratic socialism. Barrow's criticism is very far-reaching and runs through almost all aspects of the GDR system, which, according to him, needs a thorough revision. While Barrow and Havemann believe that the utopia of socialism, Harich remains to the soberly scientific approach of of communism. In conclusion, I would say both Habermas and Barrow strive for an utopian socialism, which, however, naturally remains very vague. And it's precisely on this point that Harich attacks the utopian socialists, who, in his view, cannot provide a concrete approach to a socialist society. Then we have a post-Keynesian approach developed by Robert and Edward Skidelsky. The book, the famous book, is How Much is Enough, published in 2012. And there is the question of the extent to which limited resources can be used for unlimited needs. And in chapter 1, Skidelsky say, or they argue, that Keynes' mistake was to believe that the love of gain released by capitalism would be sated with abundance, leaving people free to enjoy its fruits and civilized living. This is because he thought of people as possessing a fixed stock of natural wants. He did not understand that capitalism would set up a new dynamic of want creation, which would overwhelm traditional restraints of custom and good sense. Capitalism has achieved incomparable progress in the creation of wealth, but has left us incapable of putting that wealth to a civilized society. So the main critics of Skidelsky is say that left to itself, the machinery of want generation will carry on churning, and this is the point why the system is so destructive. It suggests reducing the pressure to consume. Accordingly, the main concern is to reduce advertising. A lower level of arousing new needs would give the capitalistic system the limits to growth that are necessary to counteract the excessive consumption of goods and services, the waste of resources, and the destruction of nature. Then we have a neoliberal, an autoliberal approach by Hans Christoph Binswanger. In his books Vorwärts zur Mäßigung, Forward to Moderation in 2009, he argues, like Arendt and Skidelsky, that the restriction of human needs in a way out of the growth dilemma. Binswanger explains that the modern economy is designed for growth, that it is subject to a growth compulsion and a growth urge. The reasons for the growth compulsion and growth urge in sense of Binswanger are primarily not in the production of needs, but in the monetary system. And Binswanger writes, the magic risk of money creation is that it both causes the real growth of the national product and thus of household incomes, and if growth continues, at the same time allows for a steady increase in profits, money profits that make growth attractive. Thus, money creation is profitable in both real production and monetary terms in the financial system. So to limit the growth dynamic, Binswanger suggests changing the monetary system. In order to slow down the growth of money, he suggests full reserve money, for example, introduced first by Alvin Fisher. And Binswanger goes on to say that further modification of the full monetary system in the sense of Silvio Wiesel's free money, and also suggests Rudolf Steiner gift money or loan money and other forms of regional money would be conceivable. Binswanger does not focus on macroeconomics only. He also outlines that the ownership of capital must be reformed. He votes against the pure shareholder value principle. and outlines that social and ecological aspects would have to be integrated into the principle of ownership of the means of production. And then we have E.F. Schumacher. He was, in my view, an exceptional economist with exceptional conclusions for the circumstances at his time. The major work is Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered in 1973. It became a bestseller, and US President Jimmy Carter invited him to the White House in 1977 and gave him the opportunity to present his book. Yes, and Schumacher argues that the idea of unlimited economic growth needs to be seriously questioned, and at least two counts: the availability of basic resources, and alternatively or additionally the capacity of the environment to cope with the degree of interference implied. In addition to the material limitations of economic growth, Schumacher also emphasizes that non-material aspects. The GNP may rise rapidly as measured by statisticians, but not experienced by actual people who find themselves oppressed by increasing frustration, alienation, insecurity, and so forth. And I think one very important topic is Schumacher outlines is the fundamental and vital differences between various categories of goods. So he distinguishes between first primary goods as divided in non-renewable and renewable, and secondary goods, manufactures or services. So Schumacher argues that the secondary goods can only be produced by extracting natural resources, primary goods. Of these, some are renewable and others are non-renewable. Man is only a converter for the primary goods. The conversion of primary goods enables humans to produce the secondary goods. Oh, it disappeared here. Can you hear me?
Yes, the only,
Yes.
I don't know why you didn't see the PowerPoint.
Okay. Okay,
Sure.
I will proceed. The market, and he says a very important point, the market itself does not distinguish these fundamental considerations for the market. Each good has only a price in relation to supply and demand. Schumacher calls it distinction of goods for which for the market has only prices without any differentiation as basic inconsumability. And he says it has remained unnoticed that the concept of cost is essentially different between renewable and non-renewable goods, as also between manufacturers and services. It can be said that economics as currently constituted fully applies only to manufacturers, but it's being applied to all goods and services because an appreciation of essential qualitative differences between the four categories is entirely lacking. So the differentiation between meta, so he makes the conclusion it's even more important is the recognition of the existence of goods which never appear on the market because they cannot be privately appropriated, but nonetheless an essential precondition of all human activities such as air, water, the soil, and in fact the whole framework of living nature. And he says that the differentiation between meta economics and economics is essential because the environmental aspects usually do not fit into the conventional methodology of economics. And he says that the study of economics is too narrow and too fragmentary to lead to valid insights unless complemented and completed by a study of meta-economics. As we have seen, economics is a derived science which accepts instructions from what I call meta-economics. So next slide, please. The discussion is that all diverse economists are united in the following points. First, planet Earth has its material limits and cannot be infinitely expanded for human production. Human needs increase with increasing prosperity. Indeed, they seem to be able to increase immeasurably, and measures must be taken to limit economic growth and to curb human needs in order to avoid an otherwise inevitable self-destruction mechanism. For the communist theorist Wolfgang Harich, the solution is quite clear. There must be created a communist world government. And on the other side are the less dogmatic socialists, Barrow and Habermas, who argue for democratic socialism. And the liberal-minded economists Kidelsi, Binswanger, Schumacher form a second strand in the discussion. The strand comes to similar conclusion in that they see the increase in human needs as the main cause of the drive for growth. Binswanger, on the other hand, argues that the monetary system is one of the main causes of the growth urge, because credit enables higher investments by means of money creation, which on the other hand drives the greed for profit, and on the other hand, the greed for an increase of human wants. Therefore, Binswanger proposes a full reserve money, and similarly, post-Keynesian economists would argue that the creation of new money in the form of credit through the banking system, endogenous money, can contribute to a stabilization of economic activity, because the credit system of banks allows for a higher elasticity of money supply and can thus stabilize the business cycle. Almost needless to say, a liberal-minded economist would implicitly ignore or explicitly would probably reject Marx's theory of capital accumulation, which according to Marx initializes the growth trend. In addition, liberal economists do not consider the fact of capital concentration, the unequal income distribution, and poverty to set the focus of economic theory regarding ecological aspects only, and neglect social problems in an inappropriate approach. Although liberal economists view the limitation of human needs as an essential goal of an ecological oriented economy, the limitation of economic power is insufficiently discussed. Although these economists partially engage in a modification of the concept of property, they usually do not even distinguish between private property and private property in the means of production. If the Skidelsky's also recognize the constant creation of new needs by the capitalist system as a problem, they are simply advocating for a change in the legal system, for example, by restricting the advertising of products. Unfortunately, Schumacher did not elaborate the idea of meta-economics further. It would be very important to develop this kind of methodology of the prevailing economy is unsuitable to analyze the ecological effects of an expansive and destructive economy in more detail. The concept of nature appears in the dominant economy only in relation to its utility and does not give it any intrinsic value itself. At best, the destruction of nature is validated as an external cost. So all ecological economists do not address the prevailing theory of the business cycle. According to this theory, an economic falls into recession when GDP stops rising into consecutive quarters. The prevailing theory thus implies the regulatory of capital accumulation. If this comes to a stagnation, unemployment rises and prosperity declines. Only a steady business cycle enables the capitalistic system to achieve full employment and prosperity. The fact that this pattern is inherent in the system is often widely neglected by ecological-minded economists. Thus, the group of ecological-oriented economists is very diverse. The approaches are very fragmented. For this reason, it is also plausible that these economists have played only a minor role so far, despite the severity of the problems. They all draw their individual explanations only from already established schools of economics, which they have only modified somewhat. The meta-economics brought into play by E.F. Schumacher appears only rudimentary and would have to be further developed. So this is the view on 4 different economists in this field. And we have to consider that the discussion which was started by the Club of Rome was also defeated by the neocons. They said that this model they've created is too mechanic and they have to be implemented new reforms. The beacon was the deregulation of key sectors and global financial markets. The largest major players in the financial markets became London Wall Street. The creation of venture capital markets on the Nasdaq opened tremendous opportunities for innovative companies in the Silicon Valley, in biotechs, pharmaceuticals, life science, and further developments of the computer and software industry, as well as the internet and information platform technology. And very important is the Bayh-Dole Act from 1980, which laid the foundation for the patent right of intellectual ownership. A new form of scientists was created. They took on the role for entrepreneurs and were able to create new markets with the extended patent protection of their inventions. With the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights in 1986, the USA could transfer the advantages of the Bayh-Dole Act on international law. Moreover, a new type of scientist was born, a developer with entrepreneurial ambitions of genetically modified organisms or new biotechnologies. So in the result, the reasons why ecological-minded economists could not succeed appear very obviously. Finally, it was the victory of neoliberalism by Thatcher and Reagan, beginning in the 80s. It was the nexus of pragmatism of the Anglo-American world against the old Europe. There's also to consider the influence of the elites in the USA. The classical work, The Power Elite by C. Wright Mills, 1956, explains its influences on politics and society. And ecological-minded economists belong more likely to the bottom and not to the elites of the American society. In addition to the great influence of the American elite, there are several other reasons that have contributed to the suppression of the environmental movement. And there's, for example, the language barrier. I regret that they have Barrow, Haberman, and so on have published generally in also Binswanger in the German language and have no English translations, so that it did not reach the Anglo-American sphere. So in conclusion, I would say the financial crisis was the first major disruption of neoliberal ideology, and neoliberalism is on the edge, I think. In conclusion, I would say that the rise of ecological-minded economists began with the environmental movements in the 60s and 70s. These economists had their roots in different economic schools, ranging from Marxian to ordoliberalism. And the backfire came from the neocons beginning in the 80s. The neoliberal paradigm created a new economy in the last decades. However, the ecological problems could not be resolved. And could you show the next slide, please? I forgot. Neoliberalism and neocons. And the next was why ecological-minded economists could not succeed. So yes, there are some reasons I have shown there in this, and in the result, I would say, could you show the last slide, please? What must follow up is the last slide, and so I come to the conclusion that main topics must examine more intensively in order to create a meta-economics. The next slide, please. So that was what must follow up. It is first, we need a differentiation between primary and secondary goods. Second, no major economic theory considers the fact for the need of energy. Third, the impact of the profit and accumulation principle according to Karl Marx. The reasons for growth, compulsion, and growth urge of a capitalistic economy, and fourth, ecological-minded theorists general do not differentiate between micro and macroeconomics. It should be considered in an ecological intended theory. The link between macro and microeconomics in terms of growth urge must be evaluated. And fifth is GDP calculates only economic activities. It also increases when damage is done to nature, or it must be repaired by humans. An ecological index GDP should therefore consider the negative effects of the destruction of nature in such a manner that these effects should be subtracted from the traditional calculated GDP. Sixth point is GDP growth functions by simultaneously growing money or credit supply. Probable effects of limitations of credit or money supply should be examined. Seventh is the characteristics of money as a vehicle of exchange for goods for the formation of capital and as a vehicle of speculation must be analyzed. And eighth, a fundamentally change of principle for private ownership and capital is on the bench. Overall, a few ecological-oriented economists were only able to present their theories in a sporadic and fragmented manner. A thorough revision, especially regarding meta-economics, is urgently needed in order to achieve a more coherent and consistent theory. So, thank you very much.